that can be due to a number of factors then that can affect outcomes in direct repair. So number one is inadequate resection. Number two is tension. Number three is suture irritation. And then number four is poor fascicular alignment. And then number five is this idea of neurotropism. And I'm going to describe each one of these in detail. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is inadequate resection. And so in nerve repair, this is really the first key step to obtaining good results. If scarred nerve ends are sutured back together, no matter how you repair it, direct repair, autograft, allograft, conduit, you aren't going to get good outcomes because nerve cannot regenerate through scar. Scar tissue blocks everything. And so really getting back to those healthy fascicles is the key first step. Now, this can be really difficult for surgeons because there's not a good way to determine scar in the clinic. You know, sometimes you can have a nerve, especially in a nerve that's been stretched. You know, you may have an area of visible damage, which is what you see in this picture here. You can see the gouge out of the nerve, but there is this area of scar that extends a long way in the nerve. And, you know, a surgeon doesn't have a good way to really detect that. Sometimes it's by feel. You know, scarred nerve may feel a little more woody or hard than a typical nerve. And so it is a difficult concept, but really, really key to getting a good repair. And this is a study that really demonstrates this concept. So this paper was published back in 2013, and this was a patient who had a fractured wrist with an ulnar nerve injury. And 3 months after his ORIF, he had a neuroma resection and reconstruction with a 1.7 centimeter advance. After 11 months, there wasn't any recovery. And so the surgeon decided to go back in and revise. And he took out the advance and reconstructed with a 4 centimeter autograft. Now in this paper, they attribute the failure to the allograft. But what's really interesting is that they sent the allograft and nerve that they resected for histology and printed and included the results in this paper. And so what we see here, this is from the proximal native nerve. This is from the allograft. And then this is from the distal native nerve. So let's look. This is a blow up of the picture of the proximal native nerve. And what you can see is that by far the majority of this nerve was composed of scar tissue. So really what this was not a failure of the allograft, but it was a failure to resect back to healthy tissue during the first surgery. So you can see, you know, these fascicles up here are the only ones that had any chance of regenerating. Nothing was going to grow through this whole area. And so this nerve never really had a chance to begin with. And so really, you know, there's a paper out there from 2013 that says, you know, in order to really have good outcomes, you want at least 75% preserve nerve architecture. There's not a lot that they base it on in that article, but that is their recommendation. And, you know, I just really think this drives home the point that, you know, you really need appropriate resection in order to obtain good outcomes, no matter how you repair the nerve. So the next thing that can affect direct repair is tension at the coaptation. So in an intact nerve, an intact nerve is under tension, but that tension is distributed all along the length of the nerve. When the nerve is cut and sutured back together, the tension becomes concentrated at those suture points. And increased tension in preclinical models has shown to reduce axon regeneration. Now, why would that be? Well, it's because tension causes ischemia. So if you think of you know, a hollow tube and you put it under tension, what happens to it? It collapses down in the middle. Well, the same thing happens to a nerve when it's put under tension. It starts to collapse down, that compresses the blood vessels. And nerves have a really high metabolic need for regeneration. So if you don't have blood flow going through that area, you're not going to have regeneration. Now, the issue here is you see 10% elongation of the nerve causes a 50% reduction in blood flow. But during a surgical procedure, there's no good way to tell how much tension is too much tension. So this can be a difficult concept. Now, the third thing that can affect regeneration is this idea of suture irritation. So nerve repair is typically performed with non-resorbable suture. And suture, that non-resorbable suture can be inflammatory. Now, it can be minor. It can cause just a small fibrous tissue layer around the suture, or some people can have a more severe reaction and they can get granulomas and fibrous tissue encapsulation of that suture. Now, if you think about that happening at the coaptation where nerves are trying to regenerate, that can actually block some of that regeneration. The next thing I'm going to talk about is fascicular alignment. So, when a surgeon is doing a direct repair, it can be very easy to over-tighten the sutures, which can then cause fascicular misalignment. So the best way to think about it is it just kind of smashes those nerve ends together a little bit. And, that causes the fascicles to sort of become misaligned. They sort of point every which way, and that causes axon growth to grow sort of in every direction. And that axon misdirection can end up causing a neuroma formation, and neuromas can end up being really painful. So this can be a really big problem. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of neurotropism, and this is really important for mixed nerves, so nerves that have a sensory and a motor component. And so this is a really interesting study that was done by Dr. Peter Evans. And what they did here is they took a mixed nerve and they sutured the nerve, they cut it, and they had 4 groups. So in one, they sutured the nerve together directly in its proper orientation. So the sensory fascicles sutured so that they were across from sensory fascicles on the other side. And then in group 2, what they did was they flipped it. So the sensory fascicles were now across from the motor fascicles on the distal side, and the motor fascicles on the proximal side were across from the sensory fascicles on the distal side. And then they repeated the same thing, but they used a conduit and left a small gap between the nerve ends. And so when it comes to sensory and motor axon regrowth, there are neurotrophic factors that are specific to each one. And so when they looked at the function in these animals, what they found is that groups 1, 3, and 4 all recovered back to baseline, but they saw no recovery in group 2, which had been sutured together directly in that misaligned formation. And so what they found was that even when the motor and sensory fascicles are misaligned, if you put them in a conduit and leave a small gap, the axons are able to find their way to the appropriate fascicles on the other side. So they'll actually cross, sort of diagonally, like you see depicted in the picture on the bottom, and make their way to the appropriate fascicles. So this can be a real benefit of connector-assisted repair for mixed nerve injuries.